I'm Dave Coulter, and this is the Lizard Brain Project. Joining me today is Joe Robertson. He's the founding executive director of Citizens Climate International. Joe, thanks a lot for being here. I'm glad you could join us.
It's my pleasure, Dave. Thank you for having me.
To get started, can you tell me what is Citizens Climate International and what is it that you do?
Sure. So Citizens Climate International is a US-based nonprofit organization that supports citizen volunteer policy advocates in 76 countries around the world. We started up in 2021 to take over the international program of Citizens Climate Lobby, which has been working in the United States since 2007 to support citizens talking to their own elected officials in the United States Congress about climate policy, economics, and legislation that can help us get to a climate-safe future.
Is most of your work then geared towards policymakers as opposed to the general public, would you say?
Well, our work is geared towards helping members of the general public connect with and then become essentially auxiliary support staff for their elected officials. So people talking to government about how to improve climate policy.
Al Gore started bringing climate data to the floor of the US House of Representatives almost 50 years ago. So it's safe to say that this data has been in the public conversation at the highest levels in this country for nearly half a century. But now we are finding ourselves scrambling because we have not been doing the work that we should have been doing. One of the foundational questions of the Lizard Brain Project is the fact that humans are inherently scientific. I believe that that's a fair statement to say. And yet, for, let's say, half a century at least, we have had all of the data that we need to understand what we are doing to our habitat. We have had all the tools we need scientifically to understand what that means and what the implications of that are. And yet, we are unable to actually take the actions so far that we need to do in order to fix the problem. That's the fundamental question of what this project is all about. So I'm just going to dive straight in and ask you, your organization has its finger on the pulse of the best scientific data that there is between the IPCC, the other organizations, the scientific organizations, and the scientists themselves that are doing the work. So what do you think now, this moment that we find ourselves in now at the 11th hour, what do you think keeping global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius, what does that look like now realistically?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a lot to go into there. It was in 1988 that, based on that ongoing conversation about climate change in the future, Dr. James Hansen testified before Congress. And it became very clear that something needed to be done. And then towards the end of that first Bush administration in 1992, the world agreed a UN climate change convention. And the mandate of that convention was to prevent dangerous human-caused climate change, specifically to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. It was all about the future. It was all about prevention.
And by the late 80s, you're saying that was the anthropogenic side of this was already understood.
Yes, it was. But there are a number of reasons why, our overall system of decision making is not set up optimally to get climate right. First of all, power is distributed unevenly. Secondly, the defense of freedom means different things to different people in our society. We don't all have the freedom to choose the best possible future. A small number of very powerful institutions get to decide for the rest of us. That's their exercising of freedom. And so there's really a democracy element to climate change. We need to figure out how everybody is going to be valued in the way we make decisions about the future. That's one part of the problem. In 1992, when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change brought nearly 200 countries together in agreement to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, the thinking was that would happen sometime in the middle of the 21st century, dangerous climate change. So prevention, there was a window of opportunity. The problem is if you match up the unevenly distributed power for decision making and the idea that there was a window of opportunity, a time frame in which we could wait to act, you get delay. And so we now find ourselves in the third decade of the 21st century, and dangerous climate change is very much upon us. You mentioned 1.5 degrees, right? After the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change found in 2018 that global warming beyond 1.5 degrees was effectively too dangerous to be manageable, it became international law under the Paris Agreement that danger is 1.5. So we have to do something to stay below that. Unfortunately, since then, we have only done more to contribute to the problem. Emissions have continued rising, except for a brief downturn during the pandemic. And the latest IPCC report has found that we are likely to breach 1.5 degrees before the year 2040. And that if we do, we may lose critical structural elements of the stable climate system that has existed throughout all of human history, all the history of our species on this planet. That will make it harder to recover a stable climate. So what it looks like to get to 1.5, considering that timeline, we don't have 50 years, we don't have 70 years, we don't even have 20 years to get the whole job done, basically. We need to decarbonize by half globally by 2030. That is absolutely clear. That's the scientific consensus. There's really no way around that. Overall emissions globally have to come down by half by the year 2030, 7 years from now. That's not half on a per capita basis. That's not half considering economic growth. It's half. We have to be emitting at least 50% less in the year 2030 than we are now. We are not prepared for that yet. We are not operating at the scale necessary, but we do have the tools, as you said, to get there. And the unprecedented levels of investment flowing into clean energy, flowing into battery production, flowing into the electrification of transport infrastructure, all of these things are going to be a big help.
But those tend to be private sector solutions for the most part. That we seem to keep falling back because politically it's more expedient to fall back on private sector solutions. Mm-hmm. And I've always maintained that's not what the private sector was built for. There's not a chapter in The Wealth of Nations that talks about how capitalism can address, catastrophic environmental problems that threaten our habitat. That's not in the book, right? But that seems to be what we keep relying on because politically, at least in this country, it's about all we can get through, right?
Well, so there's a couple of sides to that narrative, I would say. One is on the Adam Smith side, the whole point of the Wealth of Nations was that the Wealth of Nations is not exclusively in the private sector. It is a collective endeavor. And private enterprise can play a role to enhance the overall distribution of benefits from industry and enterprise. And it can play a role in enhancing the overall well-being of a nation. What is not often talked about nowadays is that for Adam Smith, there was a moral imperative at the heart of that. And that moral imperative was not unfettered self-interest. That moral imperative was that no rational person would want to live in a society where impunity was the rule. No rational person would want to live in a society where destruction was profitable. The whole point of enterprise is to not destroy, but to build. And so we're now in an age where we have to reconsider where we essentially went with the Cliff's Notes version of the Wealth of Nations, and where our policymakers thought if we just give free rein to people who want to accumulate wealth for themselves, we'll all be fine. We have an opportunity to look at that other side and say, when you set out to make a better future for your nation, to make a more perfect union, to make a society that progresses technologically, that has innovation at the heart of its economic activity, when you set out to do that, you should be setting out to create a society that generates more value than it uses up. We haven't consciously done that for a long time. Really, not since the Great Depression has there been an aggressive attempt to make sure we're not getting it that wrong. So that's one thing. We can add the moral element to the free enterprise system, and I think when you look at some of the policies in the last couple of years, you're starting to see that in the European Union and in the United States. You've seen world-leading examples of the public sector saying, we're going to set new conditions. We're going to give you a lot more investment for the private sector, but you've got to do the right things. And you've got to do things that are measurably good for all of society, rather than just something that can make you some money for a little while. That new type of incentive is a lever of action that the public sector has to make the private sector chase better ideas, better incentives, a more sustainable way of doing things.
Is it a fair question to ask what it would actually look like on the ground to cut the emissions to the level that you said earlier needed to happen? I mean, you don't want to presuppose what changes have to take place, but at the same time, there's a magnitude that has to be there somehow. Like, to me, I'm looking at how many airplane flights can we afford to fly? How many cattle can we afford to grow? I'm looking at a power grid that should be able to take a wind farm off the coast of Maine and should be able to get that power to Phoenix when it needs it in, when the temperatures are high. We don't have that either. I'm looking at, do we nationalize the power grid? What does this actually look like with that accelerated timetable?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I think we do need to make sure that we're connecting distributed resources so that they can work together to keep everybody running at full steam, so to speak. We saw what happened when Texas, which has its own grid, couldn't get the energy it needed. Even though they weren't connected to the rest of the country, their hardship caused electricity prices and gas prices to spike for other people whose resources were being diverted to Texas. So we need the interconnection that can make an intelligent system that has redundancy, that can work around difficulties. We need that networked system. But I think distribution is the key. A distributed system, a decentralized system is important. And in many ways, a system of private enterprise is set up to achieve that. I mean, with the right incentives and the right private sector activity, you can get a balance of, determined innovation, clear goals and outcomes, benefits that society is supposed to have, and then people competing to deliver all of that. That's how electricity grids were built. It's how the telecom system was built, with variation. So I don't think we have to nationalize the grid. I think at the community level, we're going to see a lot more solar panels everywhere. All buildings should have solar panels on rooftops. There will be buildings that are clad in solar panels. There are solar windows that you can make skyscrapers out of. One of the proposed plans for rebuilding the World Trade Center site after 9/11 had a skyscraper that was covered in solar windows. So it would have been the biggest power plant in New York City at that time, had it gone forward. So we're going to see more things like that. We're going to see more batteries of all different sizes, right? Some homes will have multiple large batteries. Some won't have that type of arrangement. Devices that we use will be better at pulling energy from the environment, so you don't have to plug something in or even lay something down on a charging cable. And some of the ingredients of that, the molecular scale photovoltaics, some of that stuff is already out there in development, being tested. That stuff will start to become more and more a part of everyday life if we're on track for 50% decarbonization by 2030, and then really fully decarbonizing sometime between 2040 and 2050.
So let me take you back to the question about the World Trade Center. because so much of what you do is directed towards public policy. Do you know why that didn't get built that way?
I don't, well, I mean, I think there was a public vote that had more to do with which of the plans was most appealing to the public, and the plan that was chosen, which didn't include the building that was ultimately built. It's a different design, but the overall site plan had a very beautiful sort of crystalline structure that was designed to echo the spiral shape of the Statue of Liberty. So some of that is just about the aesthetics, and the fact that that element wasn't built into the plan that was chosen. But it's a great question, because there's no reason that an ingredient like that can't be retroactively added to things that have been built before, or put into designs that didn't originally include such an idea.
So, continuing on the thought about what do the magnitude of changes look like? We talked about the power grid, and that's interesting what you were saying about the strengths of having a decentralized grid, because I mean, it's a double-edged sword. Like right now, in order to get power from one region that lends itself very well to one type of renewable resource to another part that maybe doesn't, requires long distance interconnects, which are really difficult for a lot of reasons to get built right now.
Yeah. I think solar microgrids are going to be a really important piece of the puzzle. So all kinds of modular energy production will be important. Modular meaning you can make, multiple small versions of the same thing, mass produce them, and get them out into the world. And solar microgrids are important. We've seen that in the aftermath of hurricanes, for instance, in the Caribbean. We've often seen how quickly that particular option helps a community get powered up again, sometimes the next day. So hospitals, for instance, some might use a generator, but if you can put a solar microgrid in place quickly, wire the building, maybe it's already wired and the wiring is protected from the elements, and it's easy to reattach a new solar microgrid system to that building or that neighborhood, then you can get electricity moving very quickly. You can get refrigeration back up. You can get services back up. You can keep people cool. You can prevent the breakdown of water supplies and the ensuing health issues. So that is going to be a very important piece of the climate response, both for quickly transitioning communities and for dealing with the aftermath of disasters, which are going to continue to become more frequent.
Right. You had mentioned the EU earlier, which I thought was interesting, because I wonder if the nature of our representative democracy is actually working against our ability to make these changes fast enough. What fascinates me about the EU is that it is one of the less accountable democracies out there, between the decision makers at the top and the constituents at the very bottom. And to me, that lack of accountability, of direct accountability, that there's more stages that you have to appeal to in order to have your voice heard by those top decision makers, to me is one of the reasons they've been so effective at putting in the mandates. I mean, I hate to say that word, but it's true, to put in the mandates that are making the biggest difference in democratic countries anyway. And I think those two things are connected.
Well, it's interesting. I think, the EU has, so the European Union itself has three main elements of governance, right? It has the European Parliament, the European Commission, and then it has the European Council. The Parliament is a parliament. You elect people to serve in the legislature. The Commission includes one commissioner from each member state who focuses on a portfolio, and they effectively are the ones who propose legislation that the Parliament then needs to approve. But nothing ultimately becomes law for the entire EU unless the EU Council agrees to it. And the Council is the heads of state. So obviously those governments are selected through their own democratic processes domestically. And then the European Parliament is elected democratically at the EU level. The European Commission, that's a system where you have appointees and then they need to be approved by the other member states to serve in that position. So it's very negotiated. I wouldn't say that it's not democratic, though. I think what benefits the EU in terms of having the ability to put these technocratic solutions in place is that there's an implicit understanding that that is the role of the European Union, that solving these technical challenges that nations may not be able to solve on their own, so that when they interact in this multinational jurisdiction or this multinational marketplace, they're doing it in a way that's fair and sustainable. That's sort of built into the model of the EU. And in some ways, we should think about the United States as having a similar model, right? The individual states also have a central government, and the central government is supposed to help those individual states interact more effectively, play by fairer rules, serve their people better. I think where the United States goes wrong on putting the right kind of technical solutions in place for something like climate change is that we have allowed partisanship to become a form of governance when the two are really fundamentally opposed to each other. Partisanship is fine for competing to make an argument to voters, but once you've made that argument, it's really not that helpful for a political party to control what happens in a legislative body to the degree that it happens in the United States. Yes, in the European Parliament or in European parliaments at the national level, you have a political party in charge. A majority is sort of setting the tone. But they have to justify themselves, right? They have to actually answer to their opponents not only in the public arena, but inside the building in a way where, I think we've sort of let that go a little bit in the United States, and we've allowed political parties to use the powers of public office for partisan leverage, for factional leverage. And there's something fundamentally not right about that. And it is hurting our country. And it is making our response to climate change slower and dumber and more expensive.
Climate change is, the way that I see it, it's the first existential crisis that humans have faced, which requires a widespread public buy-in to the science. When I think back on there's not been very many existential crises that we've had to deal with. If you look at nuclear weapons, those are generally political solutions that are not being made by the run-of-the-mill people. When you look at the agricultural revolution of the 20th century, that was kind of a scientific solution that didn't involve buy-in by the people. But this one does, because if the general population does not respect the science, they're not going to buy into the sacrifices that they're going to be asked to make. And I think that a lot of politicians take full advantage of that in order to convince them that it's not that bad. And the whole litany of misinformation about climate science and about science in general that's being allowed to take place. And that is because we have not bought in on that widespread of a level. And I think it opens the door for those kinds of manipulations, which keeps people in power on a short-term basis, but it completely works against all of us.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot about that I think is central to the challenge, right? Somehow, on the climate issue, maybe the most successful argument that has been made in terms of convincing the public is that you'll have to sacrifice. And I don't think that's right. I don't think that's actually true for most people. Most people, just like they don't have at their, at hand, the lever of change to transform the energy system by their own sheer will, they also won't have to see a great change in their own life, at least not making sacrifices. What is much more likely to happen is, just like when smartphones came in, we didn't suddenly find ourselves with less access to our friends and family, less ability to communicate, less access to information. The opposite. We found information proliferating. We found it cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to get access to communications. Some people may remember you used to have to pay 10 cents for every text message, sometimes more than that. That's very rare now, even though the phones are demanding much more power to do the same job. Um, that's the trajectory we'll be on when electrons are how we get our energy in the first place, right? When the sun pumps electrons into the grid directly instead of what we're doing now, where we have to go thousands of feet underground or under the sea to get fossil fuels, the actual fossilized remains of ancient life, bring it to the surface, send it through multiple different chemical reactions in a refinery, then distribute it out to the world through a system of trucks and pipes and ships. And then when it gets to its end destination, we need people to purchase it, burn it, and go back for more. That system is holding everybody hostage, right? So the energy system we have now is the sacrifice. The one that we're going to move into, where electrons are flowing much more freely in all directions, and we have much more ready access to power, where it's decentralized, meaning that there shouldn't be, if we do it the right way, as much of a kind of monopoly or cartel control over energy. And then we have, the Moore's law multiplication of efficiency through information systems, which will have an effect on how we manage electrons, the types of battery technologies we can use, how we can command the direction of energy flows. All of that is going to make life easier, cheaper, and better for almost everyone on Earth. The question is, how do we go about doing it so that we don't see painful disruptions in the meantime?
Right, because we have so little time. I mean, there's so much to unpack in. I love everything that you're saying about what the potentials are and what the quality of life is, and getting rid of the things that are in our way. But we have so little time. And you're talking about a lot of the examples of the thing that you just mentioned are private sector concerns, smartphones, fossil fuel economies. These things are all tied into the way that we have looked at private industry and letting private industry take the lead for so long. We have so little time now. So what out of that is actually realistic in the time frame we have?
Well, I mean, part of what makes it realistic is what money wants to do. And that means how people make decisions about what they want to do with money. And we need to start connecting climate data to financial data, not giving a rating to a company based on voluntary reports. And if they don't report enough, we just don't really know and we can't rate them properly. But really comparing what's happening through a particular value chain that ultimately surfaces as a company. What is happening there compared to what is happening to the climate? If they're heavily contributing, they need to be held accountable for that. Not necessarily because it's been mandated, but because we have information systems that are showing everyone those people are actually taking from you, right? Little by little, the people who control investment are going to start to see that opportunity. We need to make the right decisions to make sure that happens. But, because this has to happen so quickly, there will be disruption. There will be economic disruption. And that means that the public sector needs to play a role in stabilizing this rapid transition. So, right now we have huge and very rapidly escalating costs from actual present day climate impacts. And we are not asking polluters to pay for those costs. So one thing that government really does need to start doing in the US and around the world is putting a price on carbon emissions. And, in some places they do that through what they call emissions trading. Whether there's a pricing effect is one question. Whether polluters are paying is another. We need to do it in a way where polluters pay and not everyday people, not the people who can't afford to spend a few extra cents on milk. They can't be asked to finance the, oil and gas industry becoming responsible for their own costs. The polluters need to become responsible for their own costs. So if you put a steadily rising fee on carbon emitting fuels that cause climate change, and then you return those revenues to households, what you end up getting is an economy where everybody's free to make good choices, but the dirty choice is more and more and more expensive and unattractive and economically unsustainable as a business model. That is a helpful way to use the levers of public policy to let the economy naturally go in the right direction, to help people make better choices.
But that still comes back to policies that are agreed to in a democratic system. I mean, we can't even get gas taxes raised half the time. Um, so when you're talking about making a commodity more expensive because it's polluting or whatever, you still
Yeah.
have to get that through the legislatures.
This is why it's important to give revenues back to households. Everybody wants to cut taxes and also have revenues for government at the same time, right? We want to cut taxes and have the biggest military in history. Well, you can't really do that. At some point, that's absurdly unaffordable. You have to find a way to use revenues that are going to get you the outcome you want. If the outcome you want is to stop wasting money, then we have to stop climate pollution. If taxing that business model is a way to incentivize better behavior from that industry and other industries, then how can you avoid everyone else being forced to pick up the tab? They need to have the revenues. They need to have that money back so that the households can cover the cost of increased fuel prices, cover the cost of transport, cover the cost of clothing and food and the other things that have fossil fuel embedded in them. That's a way of making sure that the burden falls on the polluter. And that allows everyone, including the polluting industry, to just see much more clearly what a good choice is versus a bad choice for the future. Because the option, at some point when catastrophic costs rise to the level where they're the single biggest expenditure government has in any given year, that hasn't happened in the United States yet. It has happened in smaller countries. When you get to that level, you have to start moving money away from the thing causing it. And so we might get there way too late. And if we get there way too late, and we get there in a way where we don't have the right policies in place to make it economically efficient and manageable and fair, then that same polluting industry that has been funding the denial and obstruction of climate policy will go over a cliff. They will suddenly find themselves defunded by an economy that can just make a switch because the other things have already developed. We need to do this more intelligently. We need to do it faster. We need to start now. And then, the last thing that I want to say about what will this actually feel like? What it should feel like if we're getting it right is what you see in communities that are getting infrastructure investment, a new economic opportunity, an awakening of local economies. In rural America, the worst thing that can happen to a rural American town is business as usual, where smallholder farmers, family farms, have no choice but to sell out or die economically, where the town has no other industry available to it, and where all of the money earned by anyone doing that business has to go to large actors that are driving pollution at a level that is destabilizing the climate and undermining ecosystems all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. What can happen in those rural communities if we make the right decisions, if we shift to climate resilient farming practices, if we start to include data operations that properly track what's happening with the soil, what's happening with cover crops, what's happening with reforestation, agroforestry, what's happening with free range grazing, where that's an appropriate part of the ecological infrastructure of that region. If we start doing all those things, those rural communities will see a rebirth of their economy. They'll see diversification. They'll see small and medium-sized enterprises that provide climate services, whether those are information services, data about what's happening, financial services, investment in climate solutions, or technical services. Those other things will create more robust, more diversified economies where not everybody there is focused on one thing, but they're all contributing to that thing being sustainable, the agricultural economy. Only by aggressively addressing climate change and making sure we protect nature and invest in in climate smart agriculture, well, those communities see that diversification. That's their best future. That's where those communities will see growth. They'll see young people coming in eager to be there to build that better future. If we keep delaying, all that's going to happen to those communities is more towns dying, more towns having no business operating on Main Street. So when we talk about what does it look like if we aggressively drive down emissions and start protecting nature and get control of the extant carbon, create this new investment opportunity, is actually small communities, local communities should see an immediate benefit. New investment, cheaper energy, cleaner air, cleaner water, healthier food. A new way of living that's going to feel not all that different, but just better. Freer, more options, fewer hardships.
Mm-hmm. I love the future that you describe in all of those ways. I truly love that. I think that on a political level, I think what the narrative that argues against that when those kinds of things are proposed or when those visions are put forward still comes back to this fearful misinformation of people who don't want to change anything, who never want to change anything. One of the things that I keep saying to people who question the science, who still question the science, because there's so many voices out there saying that this is being overblown. It's the scientific community is still like the word they love to say is unsettled. Oh, the science of this is still unsettled. Like we're just going to sit back and not do anything until the scientists all come out of the room and they've settled it. Like the white smoke is going to come up because they finally decided what the state of climate is. What I tell people is, you don't have to take anyone's word for the science. You don't have to take a politician's word or a newscaster's word. You can go to the source. You can go to the scientific organizations. They all have websites. They're tired of the science being misrepresented for political purposes. And they all have policy position papers on the climate. So IPCC obviously is a great place to go. What are some of the best places that you could go? NOAA, NASA, right? The National Academies of Science. Where would you say is the best sources of solid information about the science?
Exactly. So you can go to ipcc.ch. It's a Swiss based organization, global organization. You can go to look up the National Climate Assessment, which is the biggest single integral science operation in the world working on climate. It's 13 US cabinet agencies. They produce the National Climate Assessment. It's called the US Global Change Research Program, USGCRP. They not only produce the science, they also have observers on the ground, including scientists and public officials, but also community members, stakeholders, providing input on what's actually happening, ground truthing science, as they say. You can go to NASA and look at, real-time observation of the global climate from satellites. You can look at different types of atmospheric compounds that are global heating compounds. You can look at projections. You can look at history. You can go to NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. These are all great sources for the science. And there are many, many others as well. There's a project called En-ROADS, ENROADS. En-ROADS allows you to look at what happens to climate change if you take certain actions to change industry or the economy. What will the effect be based on what we know about the latest science? And you can actually play with that and see which decisions are going to get you a better future. These are all really great, important resources. You can look at the International Energy Agency. They have promoted all of the big industries in the world to help the world industrialize, but they've also now mapped out a path to net zero, showing that it is possible for us to decarbonize on time. It is mathematically and technologically feasible with the things we have today without any new generations of technology being considered. And then, I think it's really interesting for the people who want to know about this. Look at the financial regulators, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. In 2020, when Donald Trump was president, put out a report that said that if climate change goes unchecked, the US financial system may not be able to function anymore. And it would then cease to support the wider economy, which means that the United States, as we know it, would fail, right? And a country with no economy is a failed state. So that's earth-shaking information. And anyone who deals with commodities include things like oil and gold, but also wheat and other, corn and other food products, needs to understand that it won't be possible to obtain those things at reasonable prices that are acceptable to the mainstream economy if we don't solve this problem. A year after that, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which is the kind of umbrella body for all US financial regulators, put out a similar report with a similar finding, showing that unchecked climate change would collapse the US financial system and undermine its economy. Again, the end result of a country with no economy is a failed state. So you have some of the most rigorous, detailed, trusted authorities on finance telling you what the science translates into is chaos. And so you need to figure out what the future of finance looks like, or there won't be a future of finance. It's really important, I think, for people to get a handle on that. If you live in an agricultural community, it's worth talking to people who make decisions in your community, at your county level, at the state level. What are we doing to make sure that we have climate smart commodities coming out of our region? Because those might be the only ones that are viable someday. That'll be our future. It's really important to talk to people who are making decisions about infrastructure in your local community to figure out if they're making the kind of decisions that are going to make your community habitable. Sea levels are rising, storm surges are getting more intense. Insurers are refusing to insure homes in California, Texas, along the Gulf Coast because of floods, storms, fires. Already farming communities are familiar with the problem of crop insurance. It's becoming easier and easier for crops to fail. So you can go to the USDA website and find out what they're doing in terms of tracking drought and what that looks like in comparison to the climate science. You can see how prolonged droughts are getting longer and more common. And you can make decisions about how you want to shape the future of your local economy and the wider economy it's embedded in at the state level and at the regional level. These types of scientific information are not only for experts, they're for everyday people who want to make sure that their life is a little bit better, a little bit safer going forward. And I think that we're moving into a time where this type of climate information is going to be more accessible and more useful to people, the way we've become accustomed to weather information, meteorology becoming useful. So most people take a look at their weather app on their smartphone at some point during the day to find out how hot it is, how cold it is, whether it's raining, whether it might rain, to make decisions about, do I leave the office now or later? Is the kids' baseball game or soccer game going to go forward? We're going to need to make decisions at the local level based on that type of information, but over a longer time scale. It's not about today, it's about the next few months or the next few years. And so it's not just about go look at the IPCC and see if you can understand it. It's really about thinking, how does this connect to my everyday life? Because it does. It's not a question of whether it does. It's a question of how does it and what can you tell others about that? One last thing that I think is really important to think more about, and frankly, everyone involved in the climate business is starting to finally think more about this, is that all the things we can do on the industrial side, on the technological side, on the policy side, will only be so helpful if we don't protect nature. And that means protecting ecosystems, protecting biodiversity. People worry about pollinators. Well, yeah, we need pollinators to pollinate food crops, but those pollinators are part of an ecosystem and they rely on thousands of other species across multiple kingdoms of life to be able to be in that place at that time. Otherwise, it doesn't matter that you have pollinators. They don't have the right conditions to exist. So we need biodiversity to be protected. But it also means thinking about what happens downstream in the ocean, in marine ecosystems. Some people would say that the chemical pollution and agricultural pollution and even pharmaceutical pollution that are going into bodies of water and going down to the ocean, that these are not climate pollution because they aren't carbon emissions. But they are climate pollution because when they make it harder for life to exist, when they deplete biodiversity, when they undermine the prevalence of biomass in a particular place, they undermine nature's ability to sink carbon, which means more carbon is extant in the atmosphere, trapping more heat. And so that is another piece of this puzzle that is not as well understood, but it is becoming already very investable. You can make choices to select the product you think is better. People can invest in that product and make money from it. It's popular to make and sell the thing that is good to nature. And there's really no ideology that aligns with opposing that. Some of our best protections against, particulate pollution, including microplastics and mercury, came from evangelical Christians who haven't tended to be friends of the environmental movement, but who felt that this was just wrong to treat nature so badly. So that's another thing. We need to figure out how to protect nature. We need to figure out how to prioritize that as a national and an industrial priority. And then we need to figure out how to invest in that and give everyday people the choices on the shelf, in their home, on their screens that give them that nature positive outcome. Because we cannot afford to lose more wildlife, more biomass, more biodiversity. It's already gone way too far. And on the science side, you can look at IPBES, IPBES. That's sort of the IPCC of biodiversity for more information about the state of nature.
Joe Robertson, thank you so much for being here. This has been a lot of fun. I appreciate your time.
Same here, Dave. It's been great. I love talking about these things and just trying to get the word out about a better future we do have a chance of securing for ourselves.
I love your vision. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks for watching. To catch the newest episodes, please support the Lizard Brain Project by subscribing. Lizard Brain. Question everything.